I can reflect on the title and why it should be different, but I was always told not to do that, so I'll just start. Okay, so we're talking about, we're at a conference about crisis, and my talk is called The Crisis of the Book. As you saw from the abstract, my intention was to think together, to put together and think together about Derrida and Levinas, apropos their conceptions of language and conceptions of the book. Conceptions that involve the question of crisis. But as I was preparing the talk for today, it occurred to me that it might be more fruitful, more useful to bracket, in a way, we can discuss it in the Q&A, but bracket the actual metaphysical content of the debate. I mean, I mentioned key issues, of course, and concentrate more on the place that crisis has in their work and in their intersection. So that is to kind of shift the focus so as to make crisis question that appears while the content of the crisis is bracketed. So when things are in crisis, they have reached a turning point or a critical point. Critical and crisis come from this, are derived from the same Greek word of krisis. Crisis is a critical moment, a turning point, which means that there's a certain disruption in the now, and specifically in the intrinsic ties, intrinsic intentionalities that connect the now to its past and future. The now is a passage. The now temporary is always a passage, which is typically part of a continuity, a continuum that is so central to our temporal experience. In a moment of crisis, something happens to this continuity. It is suspended, severed. On the one hand, severed from the has-been, and on the other hand, severed from the future to come. The etymology of the term crisis involves the use of a medical term. Crisis is a medical term. That is a critical point in an illness which calls for intervention. This critical point it's critical in the sense that life and death are at stake. So in itself, crisis does not carry any positive or negative value. It signifies that the ordinary flow of things can no longer be taken for granted, and as was said earlier, it's a moment where thought and action are called for. Thought and action are called for apropos the possibility of either a rehabilitation of the passage of time, or alternatively a rerouting, a shaping anew of a path, a course we're on, in the face of the future to come. So the crisis appears, a turning point appears, and it doesn't appear just out of itself. It's always connected to how we are tied, to the past and the future. It's either that something about the past no longer works for us. The burden of the past is something we want to disconnect from. Or, on the other hand, the future, which awaits us, is alarming in a certain sense. So there's a certain suspension between these two parts of time, and we are forced to, in a way, reflect or think of the point. So the crisis, as I presented, happens in the now. It is a manner of inhabiting the now, one that no longer sees the present as ordinary. But what happens is that it must be figured out, solved, repaired, changed, etc. And as I mentioned, again, I think there are different crises could be described in terms of either or underscoring either the past, the role of the past, or the role of the future in that. But what is important for me here is the understanding that a crisis is not a punctual event. And I'm reflecting on the title of the conference, the moment of crisis. So the moment of crisis should be understood not as an identification of moment and crisis. They're not the same temporally. But the moment of crisis should be understood literally. That is, this is the moment belonging to a crisis. And crisis is that state of reflecting on the moment of disruption. So I see crisis as a two-story structure that should not be understood just as an immediate event. So if someone gets a blow to the head, that's not a crisis. A crisis has to do with a certain understanding of what happened. And here, indeed, in the etymology of crisis, we do have always a cognitive dimension that goes back to the Greek and the Latin, and has to do with, on the one hand, a certain severing of something, but on the other hand, judgment is involved and different roots along those lines. And I mention this because in Hebrew, the word for crisis is mashber, which is directly tied to what is broken. So it can be understood, mashber could be understood as a certain, how do you say, benoni, no, in grammar, I mean.
Participle.
Like a participle, yeah. But the word shever, breaking, is very strong there. So it's really interesting also in this sense. Okay. So crisis is a moment of reflection on the now, provides an interesting prism for reading philosophical text in general. That is, how is philosophical reflection tied to the now of reflection? What is the status of the now in philosophical text? How is the now present in the philosophical work? And this is particularly interesting when we look back at Derrida's first major work of grammatology, which, as you know, came out in 1967. And it's not only preoccupied with its now, but it seems that now that I kind of have reread it for the event, the now, the question of crisis vis-a-vis the future, is so central to it. So the question I wish to begin with is, how did Derrida understand the now while envisioning the future? And what's specifically interesting here is that the future of Derrida's thinking is something we can relate to very clearly because we are the ones inhabiting the immediate future Derrida is speaking here. So my intention, as I mentioned before I go into Derrida, is to think together Derrida and Levinas, two thinkers that had a very interesting dialogue, influence each other in many ways. And maybe the connecting point, one kind of formal connecting point for the thought of Levinas and Derrida on crisis is Husserl, the influence of Husserl, and Husserl's last text, the crisis of the European sciences and transcendental phenomenology. This text grew out of lectures that Husserl gave in the 30s, unable, because of having a Jewish origins, to give them in Germany, gave them in other European countries. And this text is very important, both for Derrida and for Levinas. Levinas, in the late 20s, had the opportunity to visit Husserl's seminars just before his retirement. He writes about it and wrote a series of key texts on Husserl. And of course, Derrida too began his career with his reflections and analysis of Husserl's The Origin of Geometry and later on Speech and Phenomena, etc. So both have kind of an issue with the father of phenomenology, and both, on the one hand, admire his reflection on crisis, but at the same time share the view that there's something fundamentally missing from his position. And what's fundamentally missing, according to both of them, is that at that time of the 30s, after the Nazis' rise to power, and Husserl's kind of explicit address of that, what he calls political barbarism, what ultimately interests Husserl is objective knowledge. And objective knowledge, or the transcendental grounding of phenomenology. So Levinas and Derrida address that in different ways, but they basically say that what's missing here in Husserl is the cultural, hermeneutical, ethical side of this crisis. Okay, so I put it on the table and now I go into Derrida, hoping that I'll be able also to say something about Levinas, even if just as a provocation. So I return then we return here together to of grammatology, with a special eye to how it construes its now in relation to the question of crisis. How is Derrida's philosophical move tied to an understanding of the concreteness of the moment, the now he's in, and now there is always in itself a passage between what for him is a past and a future? And here I really had a kind of a new understanding in these last readings of this text. And as I reread the text through this prism, I was surprised to see the extent, as I mentioned, to which the question of the present, and here I would want to put the question, is this present a historical present exactly? I would say not exactly. So how the question of the extent to which the question of the present is central, together with the question of how this present may or could open up to a future, or how it opens up a future. So the book begins with a statement about the need, I quote, to focus our attention on the ethnocentrism which everywhere and always had controlled the concept of right. The meaning of ethnocentrism, which is a Eurocentrism, no doubt, becomes somewhat clearer during the book when Derrida turns to discuss the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss. But I think that it becomes completely explicit only years later, when Derrida writes his autobiographical work, The Monolingualism of the Other, where Eurocentrism becomes a personal issue, and the personal issue could be termed colonialism. But in the grammatology, the personal remains mostly undetected, as ethnocentrism is explicated in terms of what Derrida calls the famous term of logocentrism, which he presents as, I quote, the metaphysics of phonetic writing. So, for didactic reasons, I'll bracket the discussion of what exactly is the relationship between writing and speech, phonetic writing, and of course we can discuss that. So, for Derrida, logocentrism, I quote, is the most original and powerful ethnocentrism, imposing itself upon the world, controlling in one in the same order the concept of writing, the history of metaphysics, and the concept of science. So for him, logocentrism is an overarching structure that creates an order. And in this order, there's an organization, or the order organizes the relationship between science, metaphysics, and writing, when writing is always the repressed dimension, and the phonetic is the one that rules. So the reign of the phonetic comes the other side of the, let's say, the subjection of writing. Derrida writes as following. He speaks about the logocentrism and wants to relate it to his own time. It is a peculiarity of our epoch that at the moment when the phoneticization of writing begins to lay hold on world culture, science in its condition, science in its advancements can no longer be satisfied with it. This inadequation had already begun to make its presence felt. So, despite the fact that phoneticization, which means, of course, as you know, the prioritization of the voice, which means prioritization of a certain form of subjectivity that has responsibility and authority, that has to do with the logos that grounds the possibility of the stability of meaning, etc., etc., etc. Gilad a bit touched those issues. This, while this paradigm is really very much dominant, at the same time science itself, and later on you would say technology, shows us that there is a certain discrepancy or inadequation. And today, something lets this inadequation appear as such, allows it to kind of take over without our being able to translate this novelty into clear-cut notions of mutation, explication, etc. These values belong, no doubt, to the system whose dislocation is today. Notice how much the today is part of his rhetoric. I'm thinking to say Heidegger's being in time opening, right? The question as today being forgotten. What is the status of this today? So, whose dislocation is today presented as such. They describe the styles of an historical movement which was meaningful, like the concept of history itself, only within a logocentric epoch. So Derrida basically describes the process that has taken millennia, as he puts it. He's vague about the exact stages of what happens in this process, but there's a certain domination taking place. And in our epoch, in the now, in the today, something specifically happens because we are on the verge of this paradigm. The unity of all that allows itself to be attempted today through the most, and once reading it this way, you kind of start hearing the resonance of the today, which I, in the past, never kind of noticed. So the unity of all that allows itself to be attempted today through the most diverse concept of science and of writing is in principle more or less covertly, yet always determined by an historical metaphysical epoch of which we merely glimpse the closure. I do not say end. So the French word is clôture, and closure, it's okay, I guess, but clôture also has, right, the meaning of the actual material thing that envelops or that encloses. So we're thinking of a process, maybe Hegelian in many ways, a process in which there's a certain paradigm. The paradigm is becoming less functional, almost dysfunctional. We're kind of looking at something that is dying, and the fact that it's dying, the other side of the fact that this paradigm is dying, means or allows us to see it as we have never seen before. That is, allows us to analyze it, to see the way it holds power over us, to see its mechanisms of domination. And this is something that was not possible before. So we're at this point where we could see that. He speaks about logocentrism in the sense as giving us a concept of sign that determines the field of vision that it has controlled for a few millennia. especially in the West, to the point of being now able to produce its own dislocation and itself proclaim its limits. So the now allows us to see the limits of the paradigm, the limits of the episteme, if we want to go to Foucault, the limits of the framework. Something happens, it's unclear what, but where the position, where the thing, the power structure, which has, of course, content, which I'm not addressing, shows itself while losing its grip, or shows itself because it is losing its grip, and puts itself at a display. So here we talk now about the future. The future, and Derrida has two senses of the future. Maybe you could talk about one is the futur, but the other one is l'avenir, which is the one is a predictable future, and the other one is the unknowable, can only be anticipated in the form of an absolute danger. So the future cannot be understood, but only anticipated as absolute danger, apropos what we talked earlier. It is that which breaks absolutely with the constituted normality and can only be proclaimed, presented as a sort of monstrosity. It's interesting that the future, l'avenir, can show itself only as a source, in the form of a monstrosity, for the future world and for that within it, which will have put into question the values of sign, word, and writing, for that which guides our future anterior, there is yet no exergon. Exergon is something which is outside the ergon, the ex-ergon. As the preface ends with the positing of this unknown future, the first chapter of the ontology begins, and the chapter is called The End of the Book and the Beginning of Writing. So Derrida situates himself at this threshold, right? Something has happened, it's not, the process has not fulfilled itself, but has fulfilled itself enough, or to the extent that it's something about its structure can be made explicit. And the future is lurking unknown, but the only way to fathom it is through the idea of monstrosity. Now, here the book comes in, the death of the book, or the end of the book, and just to a book which for Derrida embodies. It's interesting, we think of the book as a piece of writing, first of all, but for Derrida, exactly, the book is the emblem of phonetic writing that does not make room for writing as difference. And it, of course, goes together with those notions of the author, authority, subjectivity, totality, which he wants to deconstruct. So the idea of the book, which always refers, I'm quoting, to a natural totality, is profoundly alien to the sense of writing. It is the encyclopedic protection of theology and of logocentrism against the disruption of writing, against its aphoristic energy, and as I shall specifically later show, against the difference in general. This is the book. Now, if I distinguish, he says, the text from the book, I should say that the destruction of the book, as it is now underway in all domains, denudes the surface of the text. So we're in the process, and Derrida wants to promote it's this process of destructing the book in favor of denuding the surface of the text. That necessary violence, that is, Derrida knows or thinks of himself or thinks of his intellectual activity as violent in this context, responds to a violence, traditional violence, that was no less necessary. Okay, so you understood this point. And my point about Derrida is that if we want to think of how his notion of crisis is tied to the notion of temporality, how the now figures there, the place to look is, of course, Nietzsche. Nietzsche is very central to the book, although the main theme of Nietzsche's Death of God is not. So I just want to read to you some Nietzsche in this sense, and the Nietzsche from the end of the gay science, not the known passages, but from book 5, from section 343, called How to Understand Our Cheerfulness. The greatest recent event, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, is already starting to cast its first shadow over Europe. To those few, at least, whose eyes, or the suspicion in whose eyes is strong and subtle enough for this spectacle, some kind of sun seems to have set, some old deep trust turned into doubt. To them, our world must appear more autumnal, more mistrustful, stranger, older, etc. And the question is, if this is what happens with the death of God, how can we be joyful? He says, indeed, in hearing the news that the old God is dead, we philosophers and free spirits feel illuminated by a new dawn. Our heart overflows with gratitude, etc. Finally, the horizon seems clear again, even if not bright. Finally, our ships may sail out again, etc., etc., to the open sea. So I would characterize Derrida here, on the one hand, as seeing the moment in time, the moment of crisis, is as an abyss, but at the same time, this abyss allows for a great release from tradition, and the joy is the joy of absolute freedom. Now, just since I don't have much time, I'll just, as a provocation, put Levinas, and won't go into it, but just kind of say something to that effect. Levinas reads Derrida, and Derrida reads Levinas, and Derrida thinks of Levinas as the one who perhaps is the true Jewish thinkers in the Western canon, while at the same time asking whether it is possible to do philosophy without being Greek. Derrida does not think so, ultimately. But I wanted for us to look at a response that comes from Levinas to Derrida. Now, Levinas, I should say, also is someone for whom the book is very important, and he speaks very nicely, very interestingly about how the book is what allows us to think. That is, we begin thinking perhaps out of traumatic experiences, as he puts them, but as the structure of crisis that I described earlier, it's only when you have books that the whole, you're able to integrate the different parts of time and think about yourself and start thinking as a person. That is where reason in the Kantian sense begins. So for him, he says, I think that the great fear of bookishness, because of that, one underestimates the ontological reference of the human to the book, and underestimates the fact that the book is an essential modality of our being. In this sense, in this case, he kind of reads Derrida. He reads him carefully. He understands what he says. And I'll end with a certain example he gives, something that I think may be relevant here. He says, when I read Derrida, and this is after he explains what deconstruction is. It's a text called Wholly Otherwise, a later text from the 70s. In reading Derrida, I always see the 1940 Exodus again. That is with the German invasion of France. The retreating military unit reaches an area that still doesn't know what is happening. The cafes are open, the ladies are at the ladies' latest stores, barbers are cutting hair, bakers are baking, viscounts meeting, telling stories. An hour later, everything is torn down and left desolate. the houses closed up or abandoned with their doors open are emptied for their inhabitants, who are caught up in a stream of cars and pedestrians through the streets, which have great migrations. In those days of a time between times, there occurred the following symbolic episode. Somewhere between Paris and Alençon, a half-drunk barber invited the soldiers who were passing by on the road, the boys, as he called them in a patriotic gesture, gliding above the waters, to come to his little shop for a free shave. He, along with the two co-workers, shaved them for free, and suddenly it was today. The essential procrastination future difference was reabsorbed into the present. Time was reaching its end with the end, or the interim of France. Or was the barber as delirious as the fourth form of delirium in the Phaedrus, a delirium in which, since Plato, the discourse of Western metaphysics is conducted? So my point is the following. Derrida supposedly gives us a historical analysis to locate the moment of crisis. But when we try to look at this point exactly, we see that it's only that it's articulated in terms, internal terms, that is, internal terms to the problem itself of writing and speech. Derrida, of course, is influenced by different, he reads everything, of course, cybernetics and informatics and computer science of the day. But this now he talks about, it's unclear what the now is. And in this sense, I would relate to the messianic tendency that was discussed earlier, only that the point here is not messianic, but catastrophic, that is apocalyptic. We have a certain kind of apocalypse. In relation, in the opposite to that, Levinas starts with a very specific historical anecdote of 1940, which it's interesting, and we could be psychoanalytic or whatever to think why he mentions this apropos what Derrida does with deconstruction, and who is Derrida in the story, but we can talk about it later. But he begins with a historical anecdote, and then the barber seems to be the one enacting the fourth delirium in Plato's Phaedrus, which is the highest delirium, the philosophical. So you see here the opposite stance of both of them. But the fact that they go in different directions doesn't mean for Levinas that they cannot talk. And he says, this is how I'll end, that the ridiculous ambition of improving a true philosopher when he writes about Derrida is assuredly not my intent. Our crossing of paths is already very good, and it is probably the very modality of the philosophical encounter. In emphasizing the primordial importance of the question raised by Derrida, I have desired to express the pleasure of a contact at the heart of a chiasmus.